lesson, we're going to use the conform tool to create a neat mesh over the raw terrain model. Now, from the end of the last lesson, we had gone and created this terrain model according to the 2D contour lines. But you can see that the mesh looks really messy. It's full of triangulated areas, and the density changes everywhere according to the different angles and heights. Now, what we want to do in this lesson is we want to conform a neat looking mesh that we have control over on top of this mesh so that we can delete this underlying raw mesh. So to do this, all you need to do is go to your standard primitives and just create a plane that has the corners being snapped onto that border that you had gone and drawn in AutoCAD in the beginning of this course. Now, if you look at the mesh at this point, you'll see that by default you get 4x4 width and length segments. And what you want to do is you want to increase these values, generally keeping them square. You don't want to have rectangular polys here. You want to keep this at a same distance, so 4x4 or 10x10, or depending on the steepness of the site, you would need to then increase the amount of segments that you use. In our case, I'm going to pull this number all the way up to 50. You can obviously go much higher if you want to show and reveal more detail as you conform it down. So if you go too high in number, you're going to be working with a very dense mesh that then may or may not slow down your computer viewport as you are working with it. So don't necessarily go over the top. You can always smooth it later on, or if there are certain areas where you have to have a very high density, then you can go and add a secondary mesh within that has a much higher tessellation than the one you're working with. So this is always a judgment that you have to make for yourself as you are doing these site meshes. So now that I have this in place, we need to conform one on top of the other. So to do this, go to your compound objects, click on conform, and just before you pick the wrap to object, which is the one down here, scroll down to the bottom and just tick the box next to hide wrap to object. What this will do is once you conform it, you're not going to be doubling or duplicating this raw terrain model at the bottom twice. Since it is generally quite a detailed model, you don't want to be doubling that geometry in your viewport. So now that all of that is ticked and ready, you can now be in your top view. If you have this selected, use current or use active viewport. If you are in a perspective view and you don't necessarily want to go into top view because this is by default, then you have to make sure that you use the object's z-axis. That is obviously assuming that the z-axis is not pointing sideways or in any other direction. So I generally just like to simplify it by going into top view, use the active viewport, and then click on the button that says pick wrap to object, select the raw terrain model, wait a couple of seconds depending on the complexity of the model, and once you are ready with that, you will see that now your mesh has been dropped down and it now is conforming to what that model is looking like underneath. So there you can now delete the underlying terrain model. You can also delete this reference border, and you can start to look at your terrain mesh and judge for yourself whether you think that there is enough detail. If you know that there are a whole lot of little crevices or things that you would like to reveal, then make sure that you have a high enough grid mesh that you are dropping down on top of it. So that is obviously just a judgment that you will make for yourself as you do this process. So once that is done, you can now go and make sure that it's on the right layer, check that it's on the site mesh layer, and you are now ready to go and add other details to it, for instance the driveway that we're going to do in the next lesson and all those other landscaping elements. We will also then look at how you can modify this mesh locally by using a couple of molding and sculpting techniques, and that we're going to cover at a later point. What I do want to say just before I finish the lesson is a nice tip is that once you create your raw mesh, it's a good idea to save a copy of it, or at least copy it within your viewport by going Control V, create a copy, and then just hide that copy. So you would hide the selection, therefore you would have a hidden copy of this raw mesh object, while the refined raw mesh object within your scene, so you could bring it back in case you have to change the position of the driveway, or in case you want to revert back to this original mesh that you have created. So don't lose that, or don't save over the file if you go and modify it. Make sure you have these key objects saved somewhere. So I generally like to go and use save selected, and then I just have a folder within my working folder where I have those important objects saved individually, object by object, with the date, or whichever way you want to organize it. So with that all out the way, let's now finish the lesson and let's move on to the next part, which is going to be cutting out the road and driveway and showing where the site is going to be positioned on this mesh.